start recording and start our second series of our Career Coach webinar that we are very excited to bring to you. We are again this season joined by our presenter, Maria Marukian, who is the president of MSM Global Consulting and is a leadership and organizational development expert specializing in diversity, inclusion, intercultural competence, and organizational transformation. We are very excited to present to you this new series. We will have actually 4 webinars this season versus the 3 that we did last season, as it was very successful. And we will be focusing today on resolving cultural conflict, which I won't belabor the point because Maria has will present to you a fantastic presentation, but just a few housekeeping rules before we get started. Please mute yourself. It is lunchtime here, at least on the East Coast. So while we hope that you enjoy your lunch, we don't want to hear about it. At the end of the presentation, we will have an opportunity to ask some questions, which you can feel free to put in the chat section. You'll see at the bottom of the screen. You can type your questions and we will try to get to as many of them as possible. I think that is all for housekeeping. So without further ado, I will present to you Maria Marukian. Maria, take it away.
All right, thank you, Tweeps. Happy Monday, everyone. I hope you enjoyed your 4th of July last week and got a little rest and relaxation. This, for those of you who are in the DC area, it has been super hot. So it's actually, the weather's been a little bit more calm this week, which is nice. So I am really pleased to be back with you all today and to engage in season 2 on these concepts of diversity and intercultural understanding. I think there's always so much more that we can learn about these topics and just in general about identity and how people come to the workplace differently with different value sets, different expectations, different behavioral norms. And sometimes those different expectations and interpretations of behavior can lead to conflict. So we're going to take a little bit of time today to dive into the subject, talk a bit about what conflict means, how it shows up in the workplace, and how culture plays a role. And for those of you who have been on these webinars before, you know that and for those of you who are new, I tend to be fairly interactive. I'm going to present some research to you, but I also really want this to be a dialogue. So at certain points, I will invite you to join in a conversation using the chat pod. You can also feel free, if you'd like to volunteer, you can unmute your phone and offer your thoughts or your answers verbally as well. But this will be interactive, so hopefully we'll hear some good experiences. I'm sure all of you out there who are participating have at some point in your professional experience had some interactions with people that maybe caused some disconnects or some cultural conflicts. So I'm really looking forward to hearing your experiences as well as maybe some strategies or tips that you may be interested in offering your colleagues. So with that, my first question is, what comes to mind for you when you hear this term conflict? What are some words or phrases that you tend to automatically associate with conflict? So go ahead and just answer in the chat pod. Thank you, Anna. Misunderstanding, disagreement. Ooh, Lynn, power. Interesting. Yeah, disagreement. You know, a lot of times there are so many extremes with conflict, right? Often we hear that word and we automatically think of, oh, yes, stress, disruption to productivity, Shavana. That's a really interesting look at it as well. Incompatible or at variance. Yeah, so I mean, conflict, sometimes we automatically have this sort of negative emotional reaction to that term, right? We think about it as disruption, as fighting, as bringing stress and anxiety and anger. Clash, yeah, that's a great word, right? We often think about that, and it is a clash, but it also is natural, right? We experience conflict all the time. It's really any point at which two individuals or groups have some sort of a disagreement or are not completely aligned with their views. And that happens to us on a constant basis, right? So we're going to look at a definition of conflict from Merriam-Webster: competitive or opposing action of incompatible, somebody had mentioned incompatible earlier, antagonistic state of action, which could be something as slight as divergent ideas, interests, or persons, but it can also be, more of a struggle or a tension. It also is described as mental struggle resulting from incompatible or opposing needs, drives, wishes, or external or internal demands. And the reason that I think that this definition is useful is that it helps us to kind of put conflict in the context of both external as well as internal forces that can sometimes lead to conflict. So we're going to take a little bit of time to break down that idea of external and internal forces that may drive conflict. Now, there are actually often, when we think about conflict, we consider conflict in terms of, person versus person, right? Two individuals who are in conflict with each other, or perhaps groups who are in conflict with each other. So I want to explore all of the ways in which conflict can manifest in the workplace, including, first and foremost, internal conflict, right? Intrapersonal, within oneself. So that's one aspect of conflict that can show up, and we'll talk a little bit more about that. And again, all of these categorizations of conflict can sometimes have a cultural context to them, and we'll talk about some examples of that. Then there's interpersonal conflict between individuals, which is the one that often comes to people's mind when they think about conflict. It's between two people who have opposing ideas or viewpoints or needs. Intragroup conflict, which actually happens within a specific identity group. And that could be within a work unit or team in the organization. It could be within a particular cultural identity group. It could be within a community. And then finally, intergroup conflict would be between groups. So let's look at each of these categorizations of conflict and talk through what does that potentially look like in terms of cultural clashes, as Akatoka says. So intrapersonal conflict, I think, is an interesting one when we think about it from a cultural or identity perspective. This is what's happening internally when I feel that perhaps the situation that I find myself in is causing some sort of internal conflict or strife for me. It may be because what I'm being asked to do in the workplace is not aligned with my personal goals or values. It could be that I don't necessarily feel as though I am making decisions that are aligned with my values. It could be that I feel torn. And I like this image here because I think this is a particular example that often shows up in the workplace, especially in the U.S. workplace, and I think internationally. But as more and more we see, women staying in the workplace once they start families, they are often talking about feeling that they are being pulled in a lot of different directions, right? I feel like I have to be the perfect mother, but I also have to be the perfect professional. And sometimes those two identities are in conflict with each other internally. So people feel like they're being stretched too thin, being pulled in opposite directions. So I'm curious, again, let's go to the chat. What might be some examples that you have either observed or perhaps experienced yourself of intrapersonal conflict, when there has been some sort of internal conflict or strife based on some aspect of culture or identity, where it's internal to the individual? Oh, Vera, choosing a career path. Yeah, absolutely. That can lead to a lot of internal conflict. Which way do I go? And if what if I make the wrong decision, right? Which one is going to make me happy? So yeah, a lot of times there's internal conflict when we're looking into the future or when we're experiencing change or transition in our lives, because there is uncertainty there, and that uncertainty can create internal conflict. Lynn says work-life balance. Yes, absolutely. And again, this is not just for women. Many men feel this as well, but it's something that we often hear from women leaders. Balancing personal priorities with work commitments. So this sounds like a common challenge that a lot of people experience. Feel like I can't be a professional and mom at the same time. Yeah. Time management, prioritizing. Yeah, absolutely. So even feeling pulled in different directions or feeling internal strife because I'm not necessarily sure how to balance all of my various priorities. BJ says family versus professional goals. That's a common one, isn't it? We hear so much this notion of work-life balance in the workplace. And I kind of feel like that's a bit of a misnomer these days, because there are so many demands placed on all of us as professionals to be everything at every moment in time. And because of technology, there is more of an expectation that people will be plugged into work. It's more of a work-life integration, right? How do we create that balance, even though we know that we're not necessarily always going to be able to fully shut down or unplug from the workplace? Oh, yeah, Rosanna, getting the right time management with family, especially mom and job. So that one seems to really resonate with you all. I think it can also occur often when we find ourselves in a culturally different place. For any of you who have, many of you have spent time in other cultures other than your own, and probably, live that on a daily basis here in the United States. And that immersion into another culture can sometimes create internal conflict for us, right? I don't necessarily know the rules that I'm supposed to play by, so I'm still looking at everything through my own cultural lens and trying to make sense of the world around me, but knowing I don't quite fit. Even sometimes for those of us who speak the language of the country or the culture that we're in, we still don't necessarily feel like we're getting it or that we're completely comfortable. So anytime that there's that internal discomfort, or oftentimes I hear this from people who enter into new teams even. It's not necessarily always, flying overseas to another country and culture. Sometimes it's just going from one work team to a new one. I'm the new person. I don't know the rules yet. I don't know the language in terms of jargon that these people are using, and therefore I feel a little out of touch still. And so that can create some internal conflict for people as well. So let's look at interpersonal conflict. And you see here my two little birdies just charging at each other there. Interpersonal conflict, again, is the one that we often think about when we hear that term conflict, especially in the workplace, right? That there are two individuals that are either looking at the situation from very different perspectives, or coming to the situation with different needs or wants or belief systems that are causing them to not see eye to eye, right? And sometimes interpersonal conflicts can be as benign as, you see it that way, I see it this way, agree to disagree, right? Or it could be, let's have a conversation about why we're bringing very different views to this particular problem. So that level of conflict can sometimes be very constructive, right? Let's talk this through. Let's figure out, maybe you see something that I don't see, and vice versa. Sometimes that interpersonal conflict can get elevated when our emotions get the better of us, when there is a lack of trust within the team or between the individuals. Then sometimes that conflict between the two individuals can become destructive. When people get so entrenched in their own way of looking at the situation and are not willing to hear where the other person's coming from, that's where you get these two little birds squawking at each other and kind of talking past each other, right? And there can often, again, be a cultural presence here. So I'm curious to know, again, just put it in the chat, what might be some examples that you have experienced or observed of interpersonal conflict that might have some cultural context to it, where people are maybe two individuals coming from different cultural backgrounds or different identities, and it's causing some sort of rift or conflict between them? Oh, interesting. Jargon like you're tripping. Yeah, what does that mean, right? And if we don't understand that jargon, we can take it in a very, different context, right? Merging a privately owned company with a publicly owned one. Oh, interesting example then. Yeah, absolutely, because the values and the organizational culture are going to be very different, right? The expectations, and that can definitely create a lot of strife between individuals. What else? Curious to know what other folks think. Rosanna, working in USA from a Caribbean culture, Americans are more covert with actions. Oh, interesting. Caribbean folks tend to speak out on matters more freely. Excellent example, yes. And we'll dig into that a little bit in a few minutes when we talk about the different cultural associations to conflict. But that's a great example. Conflict over communication styles, Susanna. Yeah, absolutely. Direct and transparent versus indirect. For instance, yeah, in the U.S. even, New York City versus the South, right? Or Eastern Europe versus, Eastern Asia. Very different communication styles in terms of directness. Yeah. Oh, interesting. Backdoor conversations cause mistrust. Yeah, absolutely. Loose versus tight cultures. Oh, yeah. Amazon and Whole Foods. Yeah. Yeah. And that can be interpersonal as well as intergroup, right? You can have various levels of conflict that arise when the organizational cultures merge together. So a lot of folks noticing, oh, coworkers speaking Spanish and you do not know Spanish, says Mark. Yeah, absolutely. When coworkers are speaking in a different language in front of a colleague who doesn't understand that language, sometimes that can cause some tension, right? A little bit of frustration there. Absolutely. And we can see interpersonal conflicts sometimes play out across a wide variety of different identities. Nadine says, yeah, it's not just America, but different culture with language barriers. Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. So sometimes it can be across national cultures in terms of country cultures. Sometimes it can be across identity differences in terms of religion, in terms of race or ethnicity, in terms of gender, right? Which always makes me think of the conversations that I sometimes have with my husband, right? Where, I'll come home and be slamming cabinet doors and stomping around, and he'll come in and say, "What's the matter?" And of course my answer is nothing, even though obviously there's something wrong, right? But even just our own personal styles of communicating our frustrations or our emotions can sometimes create some conflict between us, right? So anytime that there are identity differences between people, whether those are cultural or personality driven, it can cause some sort of a discord. If we are, as our two little birdies here in this image are doing, they're just kind of talking past each other, right? I'm squawking at you, you're squawking at me, but we're not really hearing one another. Oh, great political affiliation. Yes, absolutely, especially these days. And it's not just in the United States, but around the world, we see a lot of political polarization. And that can cause interpersonal conflict, where it becomes really challenging for people to have deeper conversations and dialogues. That's a great example. So there's also intra-group conflict, and I think we don't often consider this as much, but it's also an important one because even within a particular identity group, not everyone's always going to see eye to eye. And as you see here with our giraffe friends, they're all of the same species, but one's going one way and a couple are going the other way. And this can happen in the workplace, where we might even see within a working unit, within a team, there may be some contention, there may be some groupishness that's happening even within that particular identity group. So for instance, I think about teams that have perhaps different generations working together, and their identity group as a team can sometimes be broken up by just by age differences, which can have an impact on language, on pop culture references, on jokes, as well as expectations for how people should communicate in the workplace, right? And even within identity groups, for instance, whether you're talking about race or ethnicity or national origin, whether you're talking about gender, not everybody is always going to share the same exact beliefs or expectations or behavioral norms. For example, there aren't that many of us, but I am not going to say that I can speak for every Polish, Armenian, Cuban, American out there, because we all are going to bring our own diverse identities, right? So even within a particular identity group, there can sometimes be some conflict. We see things one way, they see things another way. So curious, again, opening it up to the chat, where do you perhaps see some intra-group conflicts, even in terms of some of the conflicts that you mentioned between individuals? Some of that comes down to culture. Where might you see some differences even within that culture? Is everybody from New York City exactly the same in terms of how they prefer to communicate and address conflicts? Not necessarily, right? Is everybody of a particular political ideology always going to bring the same way of looking at things? Definitely not, right? So curious, what are some examples that you have experienced maybe within your own workplace of intra-group conflict within a work unit or within a particular identity group? Got you thinking on this one, huh? Oh, lack of agreement on policy. Yeah, we could all be a part of the same organization, but have very different experiences, expectations, beliefs around what's the best way to move forward with a particular policy or procedure. Yeah, absolutely. Workflow issues, Rosanna says, how to tackle particular problems. Shavana, yeah, it's very common, even in family units, conflict about. Yes, absolutely. We could all come from the same background, the same community, the same family values, and yet sometimes be at complete odds with each other on certain things, right? And the same happens within our organizations. Yeah, absolutely. Ethics, yeah, that can create huge amounts of conflict if people have different ideas about what is moral or immoral based on their own value system. That can create some challenges. Faith says we have different people working on different projects. using the same resources. Oh, yes, absolutely. When resources are tight or shared, that can definitely lead to some intra-group conflict in terms of what's mine and what's yours and how much do you get versus me. Distribution of work and rewards, yes, absolutely. That can create some interpersonal as well as intra-group conflict. Nepotism, ooh, yes, Michelle Morris Penn. That can definitely create some struggles, right? So there's a lot in here around fairness, right? And within the group, if we feel like certain individuals are perhaps getting preferential treatment or disparate treatment, that can definitely lead to some conflict, especially if there are certain identity factors, certain cultural factors that are also being perceived. For example, if I notice that the people who keep getting rewarded tend to be a part of the same group, whether that group is a particular gender or race or age group, or whether that is a particular work unit within the larger organization, that can definitely, contractor versus employee, absolutely. That can definitely, again, when we see that there may be some differences in terms of fairness, how people are treated, intergroup conflicts can often arise. Let's look at intergroup conflicts. And this is any time that you have two distinct identity groups that are in conflict with one another, right? We have one way of seeing things, we have a set of values and norms, and we believe that those are the right way to be and the right way to do things. And they, whoever they are, have a different set of norms and a different set of values, and their sets of norms and values and behaviors are not right. This is often where we see clashes coming through, as you can see in this image from the movie from the 1960s, West Side Story, that it's the classical case of us versus them mentality, right? We're right, they're wrong. And we are going to do everything in our power to confirm how right we are and how wrong they are. And this can be particularly challenging within organizations when you have two groups that are in conflict with each other, because they tend to reinforce one another's beliefs. So it's not just my personal beliefs that I'm holding on to. Now I'm staying with other people who share those beliefs and reinforce them and reconfirm them. And that's where we see, a lot of times we talk about the echo chamber in our society, but I think that also happens in our organizational environments where we kind of, start to make decisions that either don't take into account the other group's needs or perhaps completely marginalize them. Don't invite them to that decision-making or strategy meeting because they're just going to make things more difficult. They're going to muddy the waters. Let's just keep them out of this. Let's focus on what we want, right? So that's where we start to see some larger scale challenges show up within the organizational environment if you have that sort of intergroup conflict at play. Where do you see this showing up? Again, just in the chat pod, where have you seen or experienced intergroup conflict, perhaps in the workplace? And this could potentially be not only within work teams in the organization, but even between organizations or between internal and external stakeholders. Oh, Lynn, between different shifts. Yeah, absolutely. Early shift versus late shift can definitely cause some conflict in terms of who's right, who's better, who's preferred. Finance and marketing department can often be at odds with each other. Yes. Finance versus project controls. Oh, a lot of people talking about finance and other departments having a negative view. Yeah, absolutely. The finance folks often are so important to have in those strategic planning meetings, and yet oftentimes are not called in or can sometimes be discounted. Sales department sending in business but not recognizing that credit checks have to be done before processing. Great example, right? It's just, again, When we are with our in-group, those people who share our values, our beliefs, when we feel most comfortable, right? We can sometimes narrow our vision and see anyone who is not part of our in-group as maybe not necessarily the enemy, although sometimes we see them as the enemy, but often it's just the other, right? They just don't understand us. They don't know the right way to do things. They don't have the right set of knowledge or skills or understanding to be valuable to us. And so that's where we can sometimes find some really problematic decisions being made in the organization when this intergroup conflict takes over. And again, with all of these categorizations of conflict, our emotions are at play there, right? We are looking for ways to reinforce our own values and our own way of life because that's comfortable and it feels good and it creates safety. And conflict, when people are bringing a different set of values, a different perspective, that can sometimes feel a little threatening. And so our emotions can often sort of get hijacked when we experience conflict in any of these four categorizations. So let's talk about some cultural values that influence conflict. And some of this, very wonderfully was brought up by a few of you in the chat pod. There was some research that was done a few years ago by some intercultural experts who looked at the specific cultural values that can influence communication and therefore influence conflict most directly. One is this notion of direct versus indirect communication. And this is, when you think about direct cultures, as folks mentioned in the chat earlier, these cultures tend to value low context communication. That old adage, you say what you mean what you say, right? There's no room for misinterpretation. I am verbally saying to you exactly what I am thinking without any sort of metaphor or room for different interpretations. It's pretty stark, pretty clear. Versus indirect cultures, which value high context communication, where the meaning might not be said directly or so, it's a little bit more abstract, right? The message is implied. Sometimes the meaning of the message is in the nonverbal expressions that I give you. It may not be the words that I'm saying. It may be other clues that I'm giving you to show what I really mean or what my real intent is. So a lot of times, direct communication versus indirect, as some folks mentioned, even within the United States, a lot of times folks say the Northeast, for instance, New York City, Boston, tend to be, generally speaking, more direct cultures. Say what you mean what you say, versus perhaps maybe the South, which is a little bit more indirect. Or again, I think someone mentioned Eastern Europe or Northern Europe is a little bit more direct in terms of their communication versus Latin America or Asia, which might be a little more indirect. Now, these are big generalizations. And again, differences may apply on a personal or even smaller group level. But when we think about how people tend to approach conflict, their cultural expectations around how direct or indirect someone should be in conveying their message can come into play. The other element that's really important to consider is the level of expressiveness. So people who tend to be more expressive in their communication style versus more restrained. Expressive cultures, hang on a second here. There we go. My slide is just catching up with my words. Expressive cultures tend to emote more, right? They believe that showing emotion demonstrates sincerity and progress in the communication. So not only are they more willing to talk about their emotions and show their emotions through their words, but also through their nonverbals. So more expressive cultures may use their hands more to demonstrate their point. They may use their facial expressions more in a more demonstrable or dramatic way than restrained cultures, which may believe that showing emotion demonstrates a lack of control. So people who come from more restrained cultural identity groups tend to be more focused on maintaining a calm demeanor. I'm not going to talk about my feelings. Let's take the feelings out of this. I'm going to just maintain a calm and even tone of voice and facial expression, no matter what I'm feeling on the inside. So let's look at how this can contribute to conflict. So what the research shows is that when you think about cultural conflict, there are 4 styles based on these 2 axes of the amount of directness that people tend to prefer in their communication and the amount of expressiveness. So people who are more direct in their communication style but more restrained in their emotional expressiveness tend to prefer the discussion style. We'll talk a little bit more about what that means. People who are more direct and expressive prefer the engagement style. People who are indirect in their communication but more restrained in their expression of emotion tend to prefer the accommodation style. And people who are prefer indirect but also expressive communication tend to prefer the dynamic style. So here's what these look like in action. The discussion style tends to be, again, very direct but emotionally restrained. These folks tend to prefer face-to-face conversation when it comes to conflict. Let's not talk about it by email. We don't need a third party. Let's just, you and I are going to sit down and hash this out. They tend to be very, again, they're not interested in emotions. They don't want to talk about their feelings. They want to focus on the objective facts and data. And they're very interested in the details of the nature of the conflict, right? Verbal correctness is very important to them. So people who come from the discussion style of conflict, this again is a very American proverb, say what you mean what you say, is very important to them, right? I am not going to try to sugarcoat this for you. I'm going to tell you what I'm thinking, but I don't need this to become some, emotional, emotions don't have a place in this conversation for the people who come from the discussion style. We often see this, again, not always, but generally from a cultural standpoint, those more reserved, emotionally reserved, but direct cultures. For instance, generally speaking, in the United States, a lot of folks prefer the discussion style, although not always. There's definitely a spectrum, as well as sometimes the more northeastern countries in Europe. Let's look at the engagement style. Now, this is direct communication as well as emotionally expressive. So these individuals also tend to prefer face-to-face communication, and they want to show their feelings to demonstrate sincerity. So the more that they are talking about and expressing their emotions around a particular situation, which may be verbally expressing it, sometimes this means that if they feel strongly or intensely about something, their voice might rise. They may use their hands or their bodies more, in larger gestures to demonstrate that they feel passionately about this. They care deeply about this. And to them, that is a signal of, hey, we're getting somewhere. We're having an honest conversation about how we feel and how we see things. And they tend to be very openly expressive about their disagreements with others. And they will often also use humor to relieve the tension because they know that the emotions are perhaps higher. So they might try to liven it up with some humor, but at the same time, they're not going to hold back in terms of their feelings about a particular situation. So there's this great Irish proverb, what is nearest the heart is nearest the mouth, right? And that is the true sign of the engagement conflict style. If we think about, now we're looking at the more indirect approach to conflict. Accommodation is indirect as well as restrained. So these are individuals who are not necessarily going to tell you exactly what they think or feel, and they're probably going to, again, focus on having a very calm demeanor and not express their emotions too directly. The accommodation style, these folks also can sometimes prefer to have a third-party intermediary. I think somebody was, Vera asked, will we get the slides? Yes, absolutely. We can make those available to you. Third-party intermediaries, sometimes this might be requesting to have a mediator. Oftentimes what we see more informally is that if I come from the accommodation style, I might not feel comfortable coming directly to you if I disagree, but I might tell my friend, who I assume will then find a way to tell you that there's some disagreement. There's something about saving face, right? I don't want to say it directly to you, but I'm going to find a more indirect route to let you know that I'm in disagreement or that I have some sort of dissatisfaction or concern. People coming from the accommodation style will often use stories or metaphors to talk around the difficulties. They will mask their discomfort in order to maintain harmony. And again, this sort of, I'm not going to show a lot of emotion because that would be seen as losing my cool, right? Lack of maturity or losing my control over myself. This wonderful Japanese proverb, hear one and understand 10. So I'll give you a quick example of how this looks. I actually have, I was recently having a conversation with a former colleague who is now a director of an organization that I do some work for. So, in some ways, this person is my superior, and we've had a very longstanding, friendly relationship for many years. So there's a great deal of trust. There's a great deal of transparency and openness, and yet this person happened to mention that there were going to be some new expectations put on members of my team in terms of the work that we were going to be doing. And those new expectations caused me some anxiety. I was not happy with them. And yet, instead of saying to him, I have problems with this, I'm concerned about these these changes, and here's why, taking a more discussion-based approach, I leaned into accommodation without realizing it. And I said, I think that's a great idea. These changes sound really great. I have no problem with it. But I could see where maybe some other colleagues of ours may have a problem with it, and it might be worth a conversation as a larger group. So I caught myself at the end of that conversation thinking, isn't that interesting? I just totally fell into that accommodation style of conflict in that I did not feel comfortable offering my disagreement directly to this individual, even though we have a close relationship, and there should be no fear there. But it was more so coming from my cultural vantage point, without realizing it, I slipped into this accommodation. I talked around the difficulty. I talked about how others may feel a sense of discomfort, even though I didn't feel it. So I offer that up to you as an example of what this accommodation culture style can sometimes look like, and how it can create challenges if someone is coming from a more direct style. And this accommodation style can sometimes feel like this person is being disingenuous, right? Why didn't, that easily could have landed with my colleague saying, why didn't you just tell me how you felt? Why were you saying other people might feel the dissatisfaction, but you didn't, if you did feel it? So the accommodation style can be useful, but can also be perceived as inauthentic. And it can cause confusion. People don't know where you stand. Okay, so the fourth one is the dynamic style. This is indirect and expressive. This is a very interesting style that there tends to be a lot of strategic hyperbole, repetition of positions. Individuals won't focus on the direct argument. They will talk in stories or metaphors, but they tend to be very emotionally expressive. So there are lots of interruptions. They tend to prefer to talk over and allow others to talk over them. And they observe emotions and behaviors and respond with emotion. So this proverb here, Russian proverb, after a storm, fair weather, after sorrow, joy. And we sometimes see this cultural conflict style play out in ways that can be very confusing to people who tend to be more on the direct side or more on the non-expressive side. Because the dynamic style, for somebody who is, for instance, prefers the discussion style, direct and restrained, they're saying, why is this person flying off the handle? Why are they raising their voice? Why are they, they seem to be losing their control, and I still have no idea of what they are talking about or what they want. So it can sometimes create some confusion because they're not offering their direct ideas, but it can also create some emotional tension for those who prefer a more restrained emotional approach. So I have a couple of scenarios to show you to sort of illustrate these styles. I want to offer you a few strategies for navigating conflict that we will then try to put into practice with these scenarios. So first and foremost, how do we deal with this when inevitably we are going to come across people who have a different approach to conflict than we do? First and foremost, just taking a step back rather than getting emotionally tripped up. Take some time to assess the root cause of the conflict. What's really going on here? What am I really anxious or frustrated or dissatisfied with? What is this person really dissatisfied with? What is it that they really want or need? What do I want and need? So kind of getting at the why, right? What is really at the root of this? And then looking at the situation from multiple perspectives. There are always going to be more than one reality in any conflict situation. The way that I'm viewing the conflict, the way that I'm viewing the other individual or group is going to be different from the perspective of the other folks involved. So being able to step back and then really look at things from another person's perspective, looking at it through a lens of curiosity versus judgment is very important. The more that we understand what is going on with other people, what their expectations are, the better able we are to negotiate a resolution to the conflict. Number 3, pay attention to verbal and nonverbal cues. Again, especially for those individuals who tend to be more direct in their cultural styles, pay attention to eye contact. Pay attention to people's facial expressions. They will be more subtle. And sometimes you just have to check and say, what was that about? I noticed that this person hesitated. I noticed that this person looked down instead of saying something, but it seems as though they have a reaction to this. Checking in is really important. Number 4 is easier said than done sometimes. Seek common ground. Sometimes it's easier for us in that moment where we are entrenched in our corners. I see it this way, you see it this way, we will never be able to find the middle. Try to find some aspect of common ground, even if it's something as simple as, especially in the workplace, do we all have a common goal? Ultimately, aren't we trying to achieve the same mission working for this organization? Okay, the way that we see ourselves achieving that mission may look different, but let's first and foremost look for something that we can agree on. Number 5, accept what you need to let go of. Oh, this is so hard for us to do sometimes. I want to be right. I want to get my way. Sometimes we need, I want this person to know why I'm angry with them, right? And sometimes we need to let go of the past experiences with individuals or groups, past associations or bad results that we've had in the past. Sometimes we just need to let that go and focus on the future. And then finally, agreeing on mutually beneficial resolutions. This takes time, and we may not always get everything that we want, but being able to step back and say, what is a solution that we haven't yet considered that could work for you and could work for me? So let's look at a few examples of how these different styles may show up in the workplace. And I want you all in the chat pod to identify the conflict style illustrated, and then what might be some strategies to navigate this particular conflict. So here's the first one. Your team largely gets along, collaborates well, but you have some impatience with one of your colleagues who you are starting to believe is not very trustworthy. He is very amiable and often agrees with you face to face. But then you hear through the grapevine, through others, that he is upset or dissatisfied with a decision that's been made, even though he didn't voice his concerns when he had the chance. It makes you feel like he is a bit two-faced. And James says his name is Dan. Okay. I'm guessing that must be somebody that several of you know. What do you think? What's the potential conflict style that this person is coming from? What might be their preferred conflict style? Yes, absolutely. Accommodating, right? Definitely not showing how they're feeling and not really being very clear or direct on what they want. So with the accommodating style, again, if we take the judgment out of it, because right now in this scenario, we're in a place of judgment. This person is not trustworthy. This person's two-faced, right? Those are judgment calls that we're making on that individual. And so we have to kind of take a step back and question where that judgment is coming from. This person may be a very trustworthy individual, but his preferred mode of communication is different than ours. So, and it's also, I mean, of course, there's also the possibility that he's not trustworthy, but let's take that out for a minute and let's come from a place of curiosity. What might be some strategies or some ways that you could work with this individual? What might be some ways you could navigate this particular conflict? What do you all think? Yeah, great. Rosanna, closed door meeting might be a great way to maybe get a little bit more out of him in privacy. Yeah, one-on-one conversation. It could be using emails. Again, if this person is not comfortable with face-to-face interaction or direct, looking for a third-party intermediary, it could be maybe emails. We want to be somewhat cautious with emails, especially when it comes to conflict, because I think sometimes what we type without actually having the face-to-face interaction can be misunderstood sometimes. So email can be useful, but it can also sometimes lead to further conflict. So it's just something to be thoughtful of. Help by another, yeah. It could be bring another accommodative person in to have a meeting. If we insist on the conversation with the person, take it as if you're putting pressure on him or her. Good question, Vera. I think it's the way you approach it, right? With somebody who comes from an accommodation style, it might be useful to schedule a meeting and ask them some questions, open-ended questions that would make them more comfortable giving you feedback. A lot of times people who come from a more indirect form of communication, if you say, tell me how you really feel, they're not going to be comfortable doing that. So sometimes you have to be kind of creative with the questions that you ask them. Again, looking for that common ground. Hey, I wanted to talk with you a little bit about what is it that is most important to you when it comes to this particular situation or outcome? What do you care about most? What do you want not to happen? What's the highest priority for you? So sometimes we have to probe a little bit and ask questions that put that person at ease and show them that we care about their opinion, and we might get some information from them in a more indirect way. Asking a question in terms of, in the past, what's been the best way, or what's been a way that you have found to be most useful when the team disagrees on reaching a preferred outcome. So sometimes just taking some time to establish that trust and that rapport can be useful with the accommodating style. And then again, really paying attention to something as simple as a slight pause, or that person not making eye contact, or maybe what are they saying or not saying, and just questioning that a little bit. I've had conversations with people who come from this style where I've actually said, I noticed that you paused there. What was the pause about? And sometimes that will just invite them to offer a little bit more and a little bit more. So it might not be insisting on the conversation, but it might be finding, again, some one-on-one opportunities to probe a little bit more, and to build that relationship of trust before getting involved in the disagreement itself. Okay, how about scenario 2 here? You recently received complaints from members of your team about one team member. They say she frequently interrupts colleagues during project meetings to dismiss their ideas. She shows her frustration in unprofessional ways, according to them, often yelling at other team members about the slow progress of the project. Yet when pressed to understand what her frustrations come from, she doesn't offer any detailed or proposed solutions. What do you think? What's the potential cultural style here? I'll give you a hint. It's not accommodating. We already did that one. So it's definitely a different one. What do y'all think? So discussion. Well, so we definitely see here dynamic. Yes. Yeah, dynamic, because here you've got somebody who is definitely emotionally expressive to the point where others are seeing her show of emotion as quote unquote yelling. And yet it doesn't seem like she's being very clear or detailed in what she wants. So that directness is missing. So sometimes the people who show up with this dynamic cultural style, if they're with other dynamic speakers, they're in their zone, right? Everyone's just talking over each other and yelling, and it's a little bit of chaos. But at the end, everybody walks away as friends most of the time, right? So there's sort of an unspoken rule that it's okay to interrupt each other. It's okay to talk over each other, because again, this sort of idea that we're putting it all out, all out there. We're expressing ourselves, and we will ultimately get to some sort of an agreement. For those who come from a very different cultural style, this can be perceived as incredibly unprofessional and inappropriate, and often like bullying. And to a certain extent, again, depending on how this person is showing up, there may need to be some conversation about what's appropriate or inappropriate in this particular workplace. She could be coming from a culture or from even another work situation where this style and approach of communication was fine. And now she might be in a different situation where the dynamic is different, and she's coming across as potentially bullying, or as Pradeep here said, commanding, right? So we just, sometimes it's just having a conversation with this person and saying, what is it that you're trying to achieve? And let me give you some suggestions or some feedback, or let me share with you some expectations for the most effective way or constructive way to engage in disagreements here. It's very possible that she just doesn't realize the impact that her behaviors are having on other members of the team because she's coming from a different cultural style. And we see this play out even across industries at times, that different cultural conflict styles may be accepted depending on what industry you're a part of. So it's not always just national cultures, but sometimes, for instance, the way that people engage in conflict in the corporate sector, perhaps in the tech sector, in a very fast-paced, fast-moving, we don't have time for you to be quiet. If you have something to say, you better shout it out, and you got to let us know. Versus another, institution or industry where that would be frowned upon. So again, it's just things that we need to take into account. But this might precipitate a conversation where you sit down with this team member and kind of let her know what's going to work and what's not going to work in that particular cultural environment.
Hey, Maria, I just wanted to quickly chime in. So we're coming on an hour in 1 minute.
Yes.
Conversation has been really good. I know that you're not finished with your presentation, so hopefully folks can continue with us, and if not, if this was your lunch hour or what have you, this will be recorded, and you can listen to it after if you have to jump off, but we hope you can stay so we can finish the presentation. But I just kind of wanted to give you the heads up that we are at the 1 hour mark.
Yes, thank you, Tweet. And I'm happy. I know that the slides will be made available to folks so you can check out the last two scenarios. I'm happy to turn it over to the group if you would like to ask questions and just, I'm happy to stay on for as long as folks need to answer any questions that you have.
Maria, how much more of your presentation is left?
There are just a couple more scenarios of the remaining culture styles.
Okay.
So maybe about 5 more
minutes.
But
okay.
But I'd also I'd be happy to just open up the floor to questions. Sometimes that can be more beneficial if folks have specific issues they'd like to discuss. So does anybody have any questions? I see there are questions about the slides, and I believe Tweets will make sure that those are sent out to you all or made available to you. Is that right, Tweets?
We haven't in the past, but we can. If you email ACCA USA, we can forward you the slides. Yep.
Thank you, Shavana. Great to have you on the call. Yeah, I'm happy to stay on for another 5 minutes or so if anybody has specific questions about conflict styles and culture. And other than that, we'll make sure that, that you all get those slides.
Okay, are there any other questions about what was presented? Getting many accolades, Maria, per usual. But does anyone have any questions about specifically what was presented that you'd like to ask Maria?
So I see a question, what's the best way to diffuse an emotional conversation? Well, yeah, great question, Vijay, and one that we get often. I think first and foremost, you have to focus on yourself and manage your own emotional reaction. And sometimes that might mean just taking a few deep breaths, seeing if you and the other individual or members of the group are able to have a conversation where emotions don't get hijacked. And if not, sometimes you might need to table the conversation and say, why don't we come back to this when we're all in a place where we've had a chance to think this through and we can have a calmer conversation about it. Because sometimes, as they say, cooler heads can prevail. And the more hijacked we get emotionally, the harder it can be to reach a mutually beneficial outcome. So sometimes just being the person to say, maybe we all need to take a breath here and come back to this conversation later can be helpful. Lynn says, what's the best way to mediate? So I'm assuming this means mediating a conflict between two individuals. And I think actually the advice I just gave can be a good starting point. So it might, oftentimes as sort of playing the informal mediator, if you feel like that's possible, is to just be a very objective facilitator. So bringing the two parties together and saying, let's make sure both of you hear one another. So, let's hear from this person, let's hear from this person, and to sometimes paraphrase what they are saying so that they can really hear each other. So I hear from Maria that she's concerned about X, Y, and Z. And I hear from Tweets that she's concerned about ABC. Where do we have some common ground? Where do we have some opportunities to come to the middle? It also, if the conflict has become pretty intense, it may be something that you want to find an external or professional mediator to handle, because it can also be really challenging if you are involved in the situation, if you're the boss, if you're a colleague, to try to mediate the conversation, because that can become challenging for folks. So sometimes you do need to reach an outside, external, objective party to mediate that conversation. So I really hope this was helpful to all of you. I'm happy to stay on for another couple of minutes if other people have questions. Thank you very much for your participation today. It's been a really great conversation, and I look forward to our next one in September.
Yes, so the next one is September 17th, and we will send out information on that probably in August, so keep a lookout for the invite and reminders, and we hope you all join us then. This will be, or it has been recorded, I should say, so it will be available to listen to after, and we will also make the slides available as well. So thank you for joining us. Thank you, Maria, for another great presentation, and we look forward to seeing you all again in September. Thanks.